On the night of November 14, 1942, a bespectacled American admiral stood on the bridge of the battleship USS Washington, peering into total darkness. Behind him, the twisted wreckage of 4 American destroyers burned on the water. Ahead, 14 Japanese warships were closing in, including a battleship with 8 14-inch guns, and his only ally had just gone blind. At that moment, Washington was the entire United States Pacific Fleet. She was the only barrier between a Japanese armada and Guadalcanal. If this one ship did not stop 14 enemy warships in the next few minutes, America might lose the war. But Rear Admiral Willis Lee possessed something the Japanese didn't know about. Something they couldn't see. Something that would change naval warfare forever. This is the story of the night when invisible beams of energy destroyed a battleship and saved the Solomon Islands. By November 1942, the United States and Japan had been fighting over a single island for 3 brutal months. Guadalcanal, a malarial, jungle-choked piece of the Solomon Islands that most Americans had never heard of, had become the pivot point of the Pacific War. A Japanese staff officer wrote in his diary that month, "The success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal is the fork in the road which leads to victory for them, or for us." He was right. Everything hinged on one airfield. Henderson Field sat on Guadalcanal's northern coast, a strip of hard-packed earth named after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. In American hands, that runway meant air superiority over the surrounding waters. Japanese ships could approach only at night, racing in under cover of darkness to deliver troops, then sprinting back to safety before dawn brought American dive bombers. In Japanese hands, Henderson Field would mean something else entirely. It would mean bombers within striking distance of Australia. It would mean severing the supply lines connecting America to its allies. It would mean defeat. The Marines who held that airfield were exhausted. They had been living on captured Japanese rations. They were riddled with malaria and dysentery, and they were running out of ammunition. The Japanese Imperial Navy intended to change the equation permanently. The Japanese plan was devastating in its simplicity. On the night of November 14th, a bombardment force built around the battleship Kirishima would steam into Ironbottom Sound and pour fire onto Henderson Field. The 32,000 tons of Kirishima would unleash hundreds of 14-inch shells packed with incendiary compound, designed specifically to destroy aircraft on the ground. The Americans knew exactly what that kind of bombardment could do. They had experienced it 1 month earlier. On October 14th, the battleships Congo and Haruna had shelled Henderson Field for 80 minutes. When the sun rose, 48 of 90 American aircraft had been destroyed or crippled. A colonel on the island sent a desperate message. "We don't know whether we'll be able to hold the field or not. If the Japanese succeeded again, if they neutralized Henderson Field, then 11 transport ships carrying 7,000 fresh troops with heavy equipment would land unmolested. Those reinforcements would overwhelm the exhausted Marine perimeter. Guadalcanal would fall, and the tide of the Pacific War would turn back toward Tokyo. But Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Theater, had a problem. After months of vicious naval combat around Guadalcanal, a graveyard so packed with sunken ships it had earned the name Ironbottom Sound, Halsey had almost nothing left to throw at the Japanese. His cruisers were sunk or damaged. His destroyers were scattered, his carrier Enterprise was still limping from battle damage, and Navy War College doctrine explicitly forbade sending battleships into the confined, island-studded waters where submarines and torpedo boats lurked. Halsey had 2 fast battleships remaining, Washington and South Dakota, and 1 admiral willing to take them where doctrine said they shouldn't go. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee was not a typical flag officer. At 54, he was bespectacled and scholarly, known for reading pulp novels on the bridge and swapping stories with enlisted men standing watch. His nickname, Ching, dated back to his time at Annapolis, where classmates noted his features and gave him a name that stuck. But behind the glasses was one of the deadliest marksmen in American history. At the 1920 Antwerp Olympics, Lee had won 7 shooting medals, 5 of them gold. In 1907, at 19 years old, he became the only American ever to win both the National Rifle and Pistol Championships in the same year. During the Veracruz occupation of 1914, 3 Mexican snipers made the mistake of firing on him. Lee exposed their positions, then killed all 3 at long range with a standard Springfield rifle. More importantly, for what was about to happen, Lee understood something that most admirals didn't. He had spent months studying a technology so new that most officers didn't fully grasp its implications. Radar. Lee knew more about radar than the radar operators themselves, and he understood that it changed everything about fighting at night. On the evening of November 14th, 2 forces converged on Ironbottom Sound. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded the Japanese Emergency Bombardment Force from his flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago. His order of battle was formidable. The battleship Kirishima, mounting 8 14-inch guns, 2 heavy cruisers with 8-inch batteries, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. 14 warships in all, crewed by sailors trained from childhood in the art of night combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy had won nearly every night engagement of the Pacific War. At the Battle of Savo Island, 3 months earlier, Japanese cruisers had slaughtered 4 Allied heavy cruisers in a single night, killing over 1,000 sailors. Japanese lookouts were selected for exceptional night vision and trained with superior optics. Their 24-inch Type 93 torpedoes, the devastating Long Lance, could travel 40 kilometers and carried warheads 50% larger than anything the Americans possessed. Japanese doctrine was straightforward: torpedoes first, gunfire when necessary, searchlights only to illuminate targets briefly. They had perfected night fighting. They were confident. Against this force, Admiral Lee had exactly 6 ships, the battleships Washington and South Dakota, screened by 4 destroyers. The destroyers, Walk, Preston, Benham, and Gwynn, had never operated together before. They were from 4 different divisions, hastily assembled simply because they had the most fuel remaining. But Lee possessed something the Japanese couldn't see or counter. Mounted on Washington's foremast was an SG radar, a new surface search system using microwave technology adapted from British designs. Its circular display, the ancestor of every radar screen that would follow, could detect ships at 17 miles and track them through smoke and darkness. And feeding data to Washington's main battery was fire control radar. Electronic eyes that could measure range and bearing with 40-yard accuracy, feeding continuous targeting solutions to the mechanical computers deep in the ship's plotting room. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their shipboard radars, such as they were, remained shut down under radio silence. Their gunnery depended entirely on optical rangefinders and human vision. At 11 p.m. on November 14th, Task Force 64 passed between Savo Island and Cape Esperance. Ahead lay darkness, enemy ships, and the decisive moment of the Guadalcanal campaign. At exactly midnight, the first minute of November 15th, Washington's SG radar painted the first contact. Range, 19,600 yards, bearing 115 degrees true. Japanese ships, somewhere beyond the darkness. For 20 minutes, Lee tracked the enemy formation, watching the radar returns separate and move. The Japanese had no idea they were being watched. Their lookouts scanned the blackness, seeing nothing. Their floatplanes had reported the American force hours earlier, but critically they had misidentified Washington and South Dakota as cruisers. Kondo believed he faced a cruiser-destroyer group. He was about to send his battleship against what he thought were lesser prey. At 12:16 a.m., Lee gave the order. Washington's main battery spoke. 9 16-inch rifles hurled shells weighing 2,700 pounds each toward the light cruiser Sendai, which was scouting ahead of the Japanese formation. The first salvo was over. The second straddled. Sendai made smoke and fled, her captain suddenly aware that he faced something far more dangerous than cruisers. South Dakota joined the barrage, her own 9 16-inch guns thundering into the night. Star shells arced overhead, bathing the Japanese ships in flickering light. The opening phase had begun. What happened next was chaos. The Japanese responded with their deadliest weapons, not guns, but torpedoes. The destroyer Ayanami swept around Savo Island alone, launching 6 Type 93 torpedoes at the American formation. The light cruiser Nagara and her escorts added 35 more long lances to the spread. Invisible death raced through the dark water. At 12:31 a.m., the American destroyer Walk spotted Ayanami and opened fire. For a few minutes, it seemed the tin cans might hold their own. Then, the long lances arrived. A torpedo struck Walk at frame 45. The explosion detonated her forward magazine. Everything forward of the bridge was blown completely clear of the hull in a single cataclysmic instant. The shattered destroyer began sinking immediately, and as her stern slipped beneath the surface, her depth charges exploded, killing survivors who had just leaped into the water. 80 men died. Commander Thomas Fraser went down with his ship. Preston took multiple hits from Nagara's accurate 6-inch guns. One shell struck between her fire rooms, killing every man inside. Another hit the gun shelter aft. Then something, a torpedo, or perhaps shells from the American battleships firing blind, turned her entire after section into what survivors described as a mass of blazing red-hot wreckage. Preston rolled over and sank in less than 30 seconds. 117 men died, including her captain. Benham took a long lance to the bow. The explosion ripped away 15 feet of ship, back to the forward magazine bulkhead. Remarkably, no one died in the initial blast, but the destroyer was finished as a fighting unit. Gwyn was hit repeatedly, losing engines and taking on water. In 12 minutes, Lee had lost 3 of his 4 destroyers. The survivors were burning, scattered, sinking, and now the Japanese main body was closing in. On South Dakota, catastrophe struck without warning. At 12:33 a.m., as her aft turret fired over the stern, the shock did something unexpected. The chief engineer had locked down circuit breakers during earlier repairs, a violation of safety procedures that had seemed minor at the time. Now the concussion caused the electrical system to overload. In an instant, South Dakota lost everything: power, radar, gyros, fire control, communications. The ship went dark. Captain Thomas Gatch stood on the bridge of a 35,000-ton battleship that had suddenly gone blind and deaf. His crew fought in darkness to isolate the short circuit. For 6 agonizing minutes they had no radar, no fire control, no way to see what was hunting them. When power returned, it was incomplete. The SG surface search radar remained offline. And South Dakota had drifted out of formation, directly between the burning American destroyers and the approaching Japanese fleet. She was silhouetted against the flames, a perfect target. At 12:48 a.m., 4 Japanese searchlights stabbed through the darkness and pinned South Dakota in their glare. The Japanese had found her. Kirishima opened fire immediately. What followed was slaughter. Every Japanese ship that could bring guns to bear turned on South Dakota. Kirishima's 14-inch main battery fired salvos as fast as her crews could load. The heavy cruisers Otago and Takao added 8-inch shells to the barrage. Destroyers contributed their 5-inch guns. Streams of tracers from light weapons crisscrossed the night. On South Dakota's bridge, Captain Gatch could only wait and endure. His fire control systems were barely functional, his radar was incomplete, and he couldn't return effective fire at targets he couldn't see. Shell after shell struck home. An 8-inch round exploded against the superstructure. Another hit the forward fire control director. Shells smashed into the radar plot, killing Ensign Canfield at his station. The foremast became a mass of twisted metal. South Dakota took at least 26 hits in the next few minutes. One estimated 14-inch shell, 18 8-inch shells, 6 6-inch shells, and smaller projectiles. Fires erupted throughout her superstructure. The men inside the foremast tower worked in total darkness, searching by feel for the dead. As one officer later wrote, they would not soon forget the things they found. Among the wounded was a 12-year-old boy. Calvin Graham had lied about his age to enlist. Now shrapnel tore through his jaw, and he fell 3 stories through the ship's superstructure. Despite his injuries, he crawled through the darkness, making tourniquets from the belts of dead men and giving cigarettes to the wounded. "It was a long night," he said later. "It aged me." 39 men died aboard South Dakota. 59 more were wounded. But her armor held. The belt and deck plating designed to protect her vitals did their job. The shells that struck her superstructure were devastating to her crew and equipment, but they couldn't sink her. Yet as long as the Japanese concentrated on South Dakota, they failed to notice something critical. They had lost track of Washington. Willis Lee had a decision to make. His flagship was tracking targets on radar, but one of those radar returns might be South Dakota. In the chaos and darkness, with burning destroyers and maneuvering ships everywhere, he couldn't be certain which blip was friend and which was enemy. Washington had not fired since the opening barrage. She had slipped away from the engagement, circling north, her crew watching the Japanese pour fire into their sister ship. If Lee fired at the wrong target, he would kill Americans. If he waited too long, the Japanese might realize Washington was still in the fight. The seconds stretched out. Then the Japanese searchlights solved the problem. When they illuminated South Dakota, they confirmed exactly which ship was which. The fat radar return Lee had been watching, the one not being illuminated, had to be Japanese. At exactly midnight, 12 o'clock on the morning of November 15th, Lee gave the order that would decide the battle. Fire. Washington opened fire on Kirishima at a range of 8,400 yards, point blank, for naval rifles. All 9 16-inch guns fired together. The shells, each one weighing more than a small car, crossed the distance in seconds, traveling at 2,600 feet per second. The first salvo was a straddle. Massive columns of water erupted around Kirishima's hull, soaking her bridge crew. Before the Japanese could understand what was happening, the second salvo arrived. A 16-inch shell struck Kirishima's compass bridge. The explosion turned the heart of the Japanese battleship's command structure into, as one survivor described it, total destruction. The forward radio room at the base of the foremast was demolished. Officers and men simply ceased to exist. Seconds later, the third salvo hit amidships. 16-inch armor-piercing shells, designed to penetrate hardened steel and explode deep inside a ship, detonated Kirishima's secondary battery magazines. 2 holes, each 30 feet in diameter, were blown through her deck. The 6-inch gun casemates became furnaces. Fires erupted across the ship. Washington's gunnery officer watched through his optics, observing the fall of shot on radar, correcting aim, ordering the next salvo. The fire control computer deep in the ship's plotting room integrated radar data, compensated for ship movement, calculated ballistic solutions, and transmitted firing orders to the turrets. The Japanese couldn't see Washington. They couldn't target her. They couldn't even properly identify her. Sailors on Nagara reported sighting a ship with a strange foremast resembling North Carolina class. But by then, it was far too late. At 12:02 a.m., Washington briefly checked fire. Someone had reported, erroneously, that the target had sunk. Lee's officers watched through their optics. Kirishima was still firing, flames visible from 3 turrets. "If you can see anything to shoot at," Lee called from the bridge, "go ahead." Washington resumed fire. For the next 2 minutes and 45 seconds, 16-inch shells continued to walk across Kirishima's hull. Hits struck the forward turret barbettes, destroying turrets 1 and 2. Hits penetrated below the waterline, flooding compartments and shorting out the electrical systems that controlled the rudders. Hits smashed the hydraulic pump rooms, cutting power to the aft turrets. By 12:07 a.m., 7 minutes after Washington opened fire, Kirishima had received 9 confirmed 16-inch hits and approximately 45-inch hits from Washington's secondary battery. Some analyses suggest as many as 20 major caliber impacts. The battleship's steering was destroyed, her rudder jammed. She began circling uncontrollably to port. At 12:07 a.m., Washington ceased fire. Kirishima was burning and heading away. The engagement was over. 75 16-inch shells, 107 5-inch shells, 7 minutes, 1 battleship destroyed, all of it guided by invisible beams of electromagnetic energy, bouncing off metal hulls and returning to antennas that the Japanese didn't even know existed. Captain Iwabuchi Sanji fought for 2 hours to save his ship. He ordered the forward magazines flooded to prevent catastrophic explosion. He called for destroyers to tow Kirishima to safety, or at least to beach her on Guadalcanal. He sent divers to attempt repairs on the steering compartment. They couldn't penetrate the jammed, watertight scuttles. The ship wouldn't respond. Her rudder was locked. Her engines could still turn, but she only circled endlessly, making 1.5 complete rotations before the flooding robbed her of power. At 2:25 a.m., destroyers came alongside to evacuate the crew. The Emperor's portrait was transferred first, following Japanese naval tradition, then the wounded, then the crew, division by division. As approximately 300 men remained aboard, the list suddenly shifted. Kirishima lurched to port. The sea rushed over her decks. She capsized almost without warning, throwing men into the water and nearly crushing the destroyer Teruzuki. At 3:25 a.m. on November 15, 1942, the battleship Kirishima disappeared beneath the waters of Ironbottom Sound. 212 of her crew went with her. The next morning, American aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise found Rear Admiral Tanaka's transport convoy. Without Kirishima's bombardment, the airfield was intact. Its aircraft were operational. And they descended on the transports like hawks. 7 transports were sunk outright during daylight attacks. The 4 that survived long enough to beach themselves on Guadalcanal were destroyed where they sat. Dive bombers and the destroyer Meade, finishing what the naval battle had started. Of the 12,000 soldiers and the tons of equipment Japan had intended to land on Guadalcanal, approximately 2,000 troops made it ashore. They brought with them 260 cases of ammunition and 1,500 bags of rice, a 4-day supply. It was not nearly enough to change anything. The losses were catastrophic for Japan. In 3 days of fighting, the first and second naval battles of Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy lost 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transports. 2 of Japan's 4 fast battleships were gone. The veteran sailors killed in those ships could not be replaced. The Americans had paid heavily as well. 2 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, over 1,700 dead. But American shipyards were already laying keels for replacements. American training programs were already producing new crews. Japan had no such reserves. Admiral Lee understood exactly what had happened, and why. In his after-action report, he wrote with unusual candor, "We realized then, and it should not be forgotten now, that our entire superiority was due almost entirely to our possession of radar. Certainly we have no edge on the Japanese in experience, skill, training, or performance of personnel." Radar had done what Japanese lookouts could not. It had found targets in darkness. It had measured ranges precisely. It had spotted the fall of shells and corrected aim. It had allowed 1 American battleship, operating alone, to destroy an enemy battleship in 7 minutes while remaining virtually invisible. The era of optical night fighting, of searchlights and star shells and superior binoculars, was ending. The future belonged to electronics. Franklin Roosevelt received news of the victory within hours. His assessment: "It would seem that the turning point in this war has at last been reached." He was not wrong. After November 15th, Japan never again launched a major offensive operation in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy never again committed battleships to the waters around Guadalcanal. The troops on the island, starving and sick, began to prepare for evacuation rather than attack. On February 9, 1943, American forces declared Guadalcanal secure. Willis Lee would command battleships in every major Pacific naval engagement that followed, from the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf. His understanding of radar and fire control made him indispensable. Admiral Halsey called his work at Guadalcanal audacious planning and execution. Lee did not survive to see the victory he had helped make possible. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan's surrender, he collapsed from a heart attack while boarding a motor launch in Portland, Maine. Friends attributed his death to a lifetime of chain smoking and perhaps a broken heart at having missed the end of his war. He was 57 years old. Today, the wreck of Kirishima lies upside down on the floor of Ironbottom Sound, her pagoda mast buried in the mud, her blown-off bow resting nearby. In 1992, underwater explorer Robert Ballard found her exactly where the log said she would be, 3,500 feet down, surrounded by powder casings from her magazines, but no intact shells. They had all detonated. Nearby lie the wrecks of Preston and Walk and dozens of other ships from both sides, American and Japanese, victor and vanquished, sleeping together in the darkness. Above them, the waters of Ironbottom Sound are warm and clear. Tourists visit the beaches, birds call from the jungle. The airstrip that was once Henderson Field still operates, though it has a different name now. On November 15, 1942, that airfield was saved by radar beams and 16-inch shells, by the courage of destroyer crews who knew they were outmatched, by the endurance of men aboard South Dakota who fought in darkness, and by one bespectacled admiral who understood that technology had changed warfare forever. 7 minutes of fury, one invisible advantage, a turning point that shaped the rest of the 20th century. General Vandegrift, commanding the Marines on Guadalcanal, sent a message to the Navy after the battle. It said simply, "To the men of the ships, the men,